Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. 3 years ago, I bought what I thought would be my forever home. It sits on a full acre of land, which is pretty rare these days. The house itself is older but well maintained, and I fell in love with the privacy and space it offered. What made it even better was the price. It was significantly cheaper than the cookie-cutter houses in the new subdivision that had been built around it. See, here's the thing about my property. When I was going through the buying process, I did my homework. I'm an accountant by trade, so I'm naturally detail-oriented about paperwork and legal stuff. I had a full title search done, reviewed every single document, and made sure I understood exactly what I was buying. The house and lot had been carved out of a larger farm property decades ago, before the developer came in and built the subdivision around it. My property is completely separate from the homeowners association that governs the neighborhood. I have the deed, the survey, and all the legal documents to prove it. The subdivision is called something generic, like most of these places, and it's run by one of those HOAs that seems to exist solely to make people miserable. I'd heard stories from neighbors about the president, this woman who apparently drives around in a golf cart with a clipboard, measuring grass height and looking for violations. The whole board is made up of retired busybodies who have nothing better to do than harass their neighbors about mailbox colors and holiday decorations. I've always been the kind of person who believes in live and let live. I keep my property neat, I don't throw wild parties, and I mind my own business. I figured as long as I wasn't actually part of their HOA, which I wasn't, we'd all get along just fine. For 3 years, that's exactly how it worked. I never heard from them, never had any issues, and life was good. That all changed when I decided to replace my fence. The old chain link fence around my backyard was falling apart. It was rusty, sections were sagging, and it looked terrible. After saving up for over a year, I finally had enough money to replace it with something nice. I researched different options and settled on a beautiful horizontal cedar fence, 6 feet tall, stained a rich charcoal gray color. It wasn't cheap, but it looked amazing and would add real value to my property. I hired a reputable contractor, got all the proper permits from the city, and had the fence installed over a long weekend. When it was finished, I was thrilled. It looked absolutely stunning and gave me the privacy I wanted for my backyard. Several of my actual neighbors who aren't part of the HOA complimented me on how nice it looked. That good feeling lasted exactly 4 days. On Thursday morning, I was leaving for work when I noticed something plastic wrapped around my front gate. Someone had taped a letter there, and not gently either. The tape was wound around the gatepost multiple times, like whoever did it was angry. Inside the plastic bag was an official-looking document titled Notice of Violation. It was from the Homeowners Association addressed to my property. As I read it, my confusion turned to anger. According to this notice, my new fence violated something called Community Guidelines Section 8, F, fencing. It stated that all fences in the community must be 4-foot white vinyl picket fences only. My 6-foot cedar fence was apparently non-compliant and needed to be removed immediately. They were fining me $500 for the initial violation, plus $100 for every day the fence remained standing. I stood there in my driveway, holding this ridiculous piece of paper, completely baffled. I had lived here for 3 years and had never once been contacted by the HOA. I didn't pay HOA dues, I didn't receive their newsletters, and I certainly hadn't agreed to any of their rules. When I got home that evening, I pulled out all my closing documents and spread them across my kitchen table. I went through everything again, just to make sure I hadn't missed something important. The deed was crystal clear. My property was legally separate from the subdivision. It had been carved out before the HOA was even established. There was no covenant, no agreement, no legal document anywhere that bound me to their rules. I scanned the most relevant documents and sent a polite email to the board address listed on the violation notice. I explained the situation clearly and professionally. I told them they seemed to have made a mistake, that my property wasn't part of their HOA, and I attached copies of my deed and survey as proof. I asked them to retract the fine and remove my address from their system. I figured that would be the end of it. Reasonable people would look at the documents, realize their error, and apologize for the confusion. I was wrong. The next evening, I was making dinner when someone rang my doorbell. I opened it to find a woman in her 60s holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of self-important expression that told me exactly who she was. She introduced herself as the HOA president and didn't wait for me to invite her to speak. She launched right into her prepared speech about how she'd received my little email and how I was mistaken about my obligations to the community. I tried to be polite and reasonable. I told her I understood there might be some confusion, but that my property wasn't legally part of the HOA. I offered to show her the deed and explain the situation. She waved her hand dismissively and cut me off. She told me she didn't need to see any paperwork, that I lived in their community and had to follow their rules like everyone else. She pointed at my fence and called it an eyesore that was bringing down property values for everyone else. When I tried to explain again that I wasn't subject to their authority, she actually laughed. Not a friendly laugh, but the condescending kind that people use when they think you're an idiot. She informed me that if I didn't pay the fine and remove the fence, they would place a lien on my house. Then she turned around and walked away, telling me over her shoulder that she had a real community to manage. I stood there watching her climb into her golf cart and drive off, absolutely stunned by her arrogance. She hadn't even pretended to listen to what I was saying or look at any documentation. She clearly didn't care about facts or legal reality. This was about power and control. Over the next few weeks, the bills kept coming. Each one was more aggressive than the last. The amounts kept growing as they added their daily penalty fees. $500 became $1,900, then $3,300. The letters started arriving in bright red envelopes marked with increasingly threatening language. Meanwhile, the harassment started ramping up in other ways. I noticed the HOA president driving slowly past my house multiple times, sometimes stopping to take pictures of my fence from the street. The subdivision newsletter, which I'd never received before, suddenly started showing up in my mailbox. It contained not-so-subtle references to certain residents who thought they were above community standards and unapproved structures that were ruining the neighborhood's character. Some of my neighbors who were part of the HOA started acting cold toward me. They'd obviously heard the president's version of events and believed I was some kind of scofflaw who refused to follow the rules everyone else had to live by. I tried explaining the situation to a few of them, but it was clear they'd already made up their minds. The final straw came when I received a letter marked Final Notice, Intent to Lien. The total amount they claimed I owed was now $4,200. They were threatening to file a lien against my property within 10 days if I didn't pay in full. Even though I knew the lien would be illegal and unenforceable, I also knew that having any kind of lien filed against your property can cause serious problems. It can affect your credit, make it difficult to refinance or sell, and create a mess that takes time and money to clean up. These people were essentially threatening my financial well-being over a fence I had every legal right to build on my own property. That weekend, I started looking for a lawyer. I didn't want just any lawyer. I needed someone who specialized in real estate law and had experience dealing with overreaching HOAs. After calling around and doing research online, I found exactly what I was looking for. This attorney had been practicing for over 30 years and had a reputation for being tough as nails when it came to property rights. When I walked into his office the following Monday, I brought every document I had. The deed, the survey, the title insurance, the original violation notice, and all the threatening letters that had followed. I laid out the whole situation from the beginning. As I talked, I watched his expression change from professional interest to something that looked almost like excitement. When I finished explaining everything, he leaned back in his chair and smiled for the first time during our meeting. He told me this was exactly the kind of case he enjoyed taking on. HOAs that overstepped their legal authority were a pet peeve of his, and this one had made several serious mistakes. He said we had multiple causes of action against them, including slander of title, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. His first step was to send them a cease and desist letter, demanding that they stop all collection activities and remove any threats of liens. He also requested that they provide all documentation related to their claims about my property, including any legal basis for their authority over it. I thought that would probably scare them into backing down. Most people, when confronted by a lawyer's letter, realize they've made a mistake and try to quietly resolve the situation. Not this HOA. Their response, which came from some local attorney they'd apparently hired, was even more aggressive than their previous letters. They claimed I was subject to their rules through something called implied consent, and that my use of community amenities like the streets somehow created an obligation to follow HOA guidelines. None of this made any legal sense, but they were doubling down on their position. Then they actually followed through on their threat and filed the lien. When my attorney called to tell me about the lien filing, he sounded almost gleeful. He explained that by filing a fraudulent lien, they'd just committed a serious legal offense and opened themselves up to significant liability. He immediately filed a lawsuit against the HOA and all board members personally for slander of title, harassment, fraud, and damages. This also opened the door to something called legal discovery, which meant we could force them to turn over internal documents, financial records, meeting minutes, and correspondence. My attorney was particularly interested in seeing how they'd handled similar situations in the past. What we found in those documents was shocking. The HOA had been doing this to other people for years. There were 4 other properties on the edges of the subdivision that, like mine, had been legally carved out of the development and weren't subject to HOA authority. But the board had been treating them as if they were members anyway, sending violation notices and collecting fines for things like non-compliant mailboxes, unauthorized garden decorations, and inappropriate landscaping. The people who owned these properties had all paid the fines. Some were elderly and got confused by the official-looking notices. Others spoke English as a second language and didn't fully understand their rights. One was a rental property where the tenant just forwarded the bills to his landlord, who paid them without question to avoid hassle. But here's where it got really interesting. The money from these fines wasn't going into the HOA's general operating fund like legitimate fines would. Instead, it was being deposited into something called the Community Beautification Fund, which was controlled entirely by the HOA president. As we dug deeper into the financial records, a clear pattern emerged. The president had been using this fund as her personal slush fund for pet projects around the neighborhood. She'd spent thousands of dollars on a gazebo that nobody wanted, expensive landscaping for the entrance that benefited only houses on one street, and community events that seemed to consist mainly of catered parties for the board members. This wasn't just harassment or overreach anymore. This was fraud and potentially embezzlement. My attorney immediately contacted the other property owners who had been illegally fined. When he explained the situation to them, they were furious. They'd been intimidated and deceived into paying money they never owed to an organization that had no authority over them. What started as my simple lawsuit for slander of title quickly grew into a class action lawsuit representing all 5 illegally targeted properties. We were now suing not just for the removal of liens and harassment damages, but for the return of all money fraudulently collected, plus interest and punitive damages. The HOA's legal situation went from bad to catastrophic almost overnight. Their cheap local lawyer suddenly withdrew from the case, and they were forced to hire an expensive law firm from the city to represent them. When the new lawyers reviewed the case files and financial records, they immediately advised the board that their position was legally indefensible. The worst part for the HOA was that their insurance company refused to cover them. Since the board's actions constituted intentional fraud rather than innocent mistakes, their liability policy wouldn't pay for either the legal defense or any potential judgment. The board members were going to be personally responsible for whatever damages the court awarded. As the case moved forward, more details emerged about the president's misuse of HOA funds. The Community Beautification Fund had collected nearly $60,000 over 5 years from illegally fined non-members. Most of this money had been spent on projects that primarily benefited the board members' own properties, or on administrative expenses that looked suspiciously like personal purchases. The legal process took several months, during which the HOA's situation continued to deteriorate. Word of the lawsuit had spread throughout the subdivision, and many actual HOA members were outraged to learn how their board had been operating. Several board members resigned rather than face personal liability, leaving the president increasingly isolated. When it became clear that they were going to lose badly at trial, the HOA's lawyers finally convinced the remaining board members to agree to settlement negotiations. The final settlement was devastating for the HOA. They had to pay back all the money they'd illegally collected from non-members, plus 10% compound interest for each year they'd held it. They had to pay all legal fees for our entire class action lawsuit, which had grown quite substantial given the complexity of the case and the high hourly rates of the law firm we'd hired. They also had to pay significant punitive damages to each of the 5 property owners for the harassment and emotional distress we'd suffered. The total settlement amount was over $400,000. The only way the HOA could pay this judgment was by liquidating their entire reserve fund. This was money that had been accumulated over 20 years to pay for major repairs and improvements to community infrastructure. The roads, the community pool, the landscaping, the playground. All of these things depended on reserve fund money for maintenance and eventual replacement. When the settlement was announced to HOA members, the reaction was explosive. These people had been paying dues for years specifically to build up this reserve fund. Now it was all gone because their board had decided to illegally harass non-members and steal money that didn't belong to them. The president was immediately removed from her position and faced potential criminal charges for the misuse of HOA funds. The entire board was replaced, but the damage was done. The HOA was effectively bankrupt, unable to maintain community amenities or make needed repairs. The community pool had to be permanently closed because there was no money for the major repairs it needed. Roads started developing potholes that couldn't be filled. The entrance landscaping died because nobody could afford to maintain the irrigation system. As for me, I received a settlement check that more than covered all my legal expenses, compensated me for my time and stress, and provided substantial additional damages. My beautiful charcoal gray fence remained exactly where it was, now locally famous as the fence that brought down an entire HOA. But the story doesn't end there. About 6 months after everything was settled, I was at home one evening reviewing paperwork for my other property. I own a small rental house on a quiet street about 10 minutes away from my main residence. It's nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place that provides some extra income. The tenant had recently moved out, and my property manager had been showing it to prospective renters. I was looking through the applications that had come in when one of them caught my attention. The name at the top was familiar, though it took me a moment to place it. Then I realized where I'd seen it before. It was the former HOA president. According to her application, she'd recently sold her house and was looking for a smaller place to rent. Her previous address was listed as her old house in the subdivision. Under reason for moving, she'd written downsizing due to financial circumstances. I sat there staring at this application for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened. This woman had tried to steal my property through fraudulent liens, had harassed me for months, and had cost her own neighbors hundreds of thousands of dollars through her illegal schemes. Now she was looking for a place to live, and fate had delivered her rental application directly to me. I picked up the phone and called my property manager. "I've reviewed all the applications for the rental property," I told him. "The one from the former HOA president looks perfect. Please approve her immediately." He seemed a bit surprised by my quick decision and asked if I was sure I didn't want to interview her first or check references. "No need," I said. "I actually know her from the neighborhood. She's exactly the kind of tenant I'm looking for, and please make sure you put me down as the primary contact for any maintenance requests or issues. I want to be personally available to help with anything she needs." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay, that's a bit unusual, but if you're sure—" "I'm absolutely sure," I replied. "Oh, and when she signs the lease, make sure she has my direct phone number. I want her to feel comfortable reaching out to me personally if any problems come up." The irony was absolutely perfect. The woman who had tried to use fraudulent authority to control my property was now going to be paying me rent every month just to keep a roof over her head. Every monthly payment would be a reminder of exactly how her scheme had backfired. 2 weeks later, I was working in my backyard when I heard a moving truck pull up across the street from my rental property. I walked over to my fence, that beautiful, completely legal 6-foot cedar fence that had started this whole mess, and watched as she directed the movers. When she spotted me standing there, she stopped mid-sentence and stared. I could see the recognition dawning on her face, followed by what looked like pure horror as she realized the implications. I raised my hand and gave her a friendly wave. "Welcome to the neighborhood," I called out cheerfully. "I'm your new landlord. Don't hesitate to call if you need anything at all." She stood there frozen, a box in her hands, looking like she'd just seen a ghost. The movers were waiting for instructions, but she seemed incapable of speech. "The rent's due on the 1st of every month," I continued in the same pleasant tone. "I prefer checks, but I can also accept electronic payments if that's easier for you." That finally broke her paralysis. She turned away quickly and started barking orders at the movers, but I could see her hands shaking as she tried to pretend this wasn't happening. As I walked back to my house, I couldn't help but smile. I'd recovered all my legal costs, plus substantial damages. The fraudulent HOA had been exposed and dismantled. Justice had been served in the most satisfying way possible. But the sweetest part of all was knowing that every month, the woman who had tried to steal my home with an illegal lien would now be sending me a check just to keep her own home. The person who had harassed me about following community rules was now completely dependent on my goodwill as her landlord. I guess sometimes life really does have a way of enforcing its own kind of community standards. The next one is a malicious compliance story. About 2 years ago, I had a customer complain that we had raised the price of his phone contract. I work for one of the main UK mobile phone companies here as a customer service rep. I've had my fair share of terrible customers and ridiculous requests, but this was the straw that broke my back. So every year, we have a PROC increase in March. It's the rate of inflation as published in November plus 3.9%. This is in all contracts, has been for as long as I've worked there. Every year we send a letter out in Feb to let people know. And every year we get calls asking, "WTF is this?" Most of the time I deal with these fairly well. I explain they agreed to it in their contract and occasionally read the exact part of said contract. What makes it more delicious is if they've bought it in store, they have a physical copy. So I ask, "Do you see where you signed your name in the box that says, 'I have read and understand the terms and conditions of the contract'?" Well, just above there, the box above that says, "I understand that as of March, the price will increase by the rate of CPI plus 3.9% ONC." And that normally ends those arguments. Well, one day I'd spent all day dealing with these calls, and I get a guy call. Let's call him Kevin. He complains about the price increase, saying how he never agreed to it in his contract. That his contract says it's, let's say, £30. And that's what he agreed to. No more, no less. He would never agree to something where the price was going due to change. After the normal back and forth of explaining it, how all companies do it, not just us, petrol, food shops, books, everything. But he was having none of it. Around about the time most people accept and give up, he was still going strong, going in loops, repeating the same arguments I've shot down already. At one point, he says he never read it, so it shouldn't apply. I asked him, "Sir, if you don't read the 30 miles per hour speed limit sign and do 70 miles per hour there, you will still get stopped by the police. Just because you didn't read it doesn't mean it's not correct. Besides, you signed the box saying that you had read it, so I'm afraid you were aware of it." Now, that was perhaps me allowing my emotions to get in the way, but he did not like that at all. He said if he doesn't get the contract reverted to what he agreed, he would cancel his direct debit and see us in court. Cue malicious compliance. I noticed earlier during the conversation that his contract was actually £60 and that his first 3 months were half price. But the agent who added the discount added an undated 50% discount, instead of the 3 MHP discount that auto removes. Well, given the call was an hour long and I was overdue my break, I finally said, "Okay, sir, on this occasion, I am willing to waive the price increase for you and revert your plan to its original agreed-upon price. Because I can't stop the increase, I will add a discount of his increase here to the line, and as you've stated, your plan to be put back to what you agreed to. So the 50% discount you have has now been removed. The plan is back to £60. He tries to talk. "But don't worry, sir. We won't be making you repay the backdated discount from the last 12 months. That's not how it works here. So I can confirm that your plan will remain at the agreed price of £60. After a stunned silence, he recovers and asks, "What do I mean £60? I explained that he agreed to a contract at £60 per month with 3M half price, but that the wrong 50% discount had in fact been added and had been left on longer than was intended. He told me to leave it alone, not do anything, but it was too late. He had already confirmed he wanted it, and even if he hadn't, we have a system in place to report excessive or incorrect discounts, which I would have been reporting him on. But this was much, much more enjoyable. In the end, it was escalated to manager, who stuck by my actions to remove the incorrect discount, and in fact, removed my discount for the CPI as its policy not to discount these. It went above her to the executive complaints team, who I followed up with and noticed he was given a letter of deadlock that he could try taking to Ofcom. It felt great. The guy had an incredibly poor attitude, spoke to me like I was his to do with as he wanted, and wanted to spit his day out in a tantrum. I claim the victory in the name of those who work in a role with direct customer interactions when they've treat you like nothing and were truly horrible people. The next one is an entitled people story. A long time ago, I made a post about an entitled boyfriend demanding to see his girlfriend's credit card statements from the bank where I worked. During the back and forth in the comments, I promised to provide some more bat crap crazy bank tales. I hereby present a few of them. At the time, I worked for one of the big 4 banks in Canada. Yes, I know there are 5 now. Initially, I worked at an experimental boutique branch. The company was putting non-cash branches with bank machines into larger stores. In my case, a Walmart. We were tasked with opening as many accounts as possible. One of my new accounts would be memorable. Within days of opening his account, he made an empty envelope deposit of several $100s. I contacted him and he claimed to have accidentally forgotten the check. I told him technically that was illegal, but didn't ask to have his account closed or him charged. He covered the funds he'd illegally withdrawn. I explained that from now on, 100% of his non-cash deposits would held until they cleared. He apologized and said he understood. A few days later, on my day off, I got a hysterical call from a coworker on her first shift alone. The same man had made a deposit in the cash machine and was raging at her because he couldn't get the cash from the check deposit. He insisted that I had told him that he would get the full amount of any deposited check instantly. I could hear him screaming at her, so I asked her to give him the phone. He demanded that I either give him 100% of the check's value in cash or return the check. I asked him if he remembered our conversation about the empty envelope deposit. He said that had been a mistake, but he was entitled to his check money. Now. He went off the deep end and said he was grabbing a crowbar from his car and removing his check from the machine. Then he said he would beat me with the crowbar. He cycled through the same string of arguments. We were stealing his money, this was illegal, I was a lying idiot, he was getting his check or cash or someone was going to pay. until he was out of steam and hung up. When I reported all this to head office, I expected them to circle the wagons and protect their employees by pressing charges. Nope. They didn't even close his account. I never saw our new hire again, though. I left the job shortly afterwards, but was hired by a main branch of the same bank within a few weeks. Here are some representative examples of entitled customers from that location. One gentleman called to complain about a large deposit being held. Yes, he understood when he opened the account he'd agreed to that, but he thought the requirement would be automatically waived because of his high status in the community. He went on to explain why he was so esteemed. He was a VP at one of the larger employers in our community. He donated to charities, he volunteered, he had even been featured in our local paper. How dare we fail to recognize his magnificence? I had to politely listen to this diatribe and then transfer him to the manager, who had to hear everything all over again. Sorry, monsieur, but you are not that special when we have millions of customers. Next adventure. In the late 90s in Toronto, someone dropped a tool into the wrong machine in a building housing all the servers for the big 4 banks in Canada. Suddenly, they were all crippled. Almost all normal transactions were impossible. We're all trying to keep busy when in comes a young woman who wants me to change her password. Now, I had a lot of downtime in my position, so I learned how the different information structures and different segments of the company connected. It was like a 3-dimensional video game. So I knew that if I entered her information into one system, burrowed down and went sideways into a yet another system, I could change her password. I explained the outage and said normally I would have had to turn her away, but said I had a backup option that would take longer. I worked my voodoo on the systems and got her password changed in about 5 minutes versus the normal 30 seconds. I handed her card back with a big smile, anticipating a grateful thank you. Instead, she spit at me, called me a stupid Q*T, and threw a pen at my head. My many years in customer service had given me great reflexes, so I dodged it. Just another day working in the bank. Another day, another crazy customer. Our branch was always open late on Thursday nights because many companies paid Thursdays. I came to hate those days because often the employees would have a few drinks before coming into the bank. My last 2 incidents are from those Thursday nights. The first involved a very handsome young man came up to my counter and asked a question. I couldn't understand what he said and asked him to repeat himself. Instead of doing that, he came around behind the counter and grabbed me in a bear hug. Once he got close, I could smell alcohol and realized he was drunk. I tried to peel him off me, but he must have really needed a hug because he would just not let go. He had his head down, was mumbling something, and had his arms wrapped tightly around my waist. By now, he had twirled me towards the front of the bank like we were having a drunk waltz. The other employees and customers had noticed my dilemma and were trying to help. One of them managed to convince him to let go. He stopped, raised his head, gave me a blurry look, and then slugged me in the ribs before staggering out of the bank towards the mall exit. We all shared a WTF glance and then went back to business. Final event. Not sure if most would consider this to be entitled, but I certainly did. It was almost time to lock the doors when a large, rowdy group showed up. They all got it line. Then I noticed one of them seemed to be swaying, gently, back and forth, like a tree in the wind. I was concerned, thinking he was going to faint. When he spoke, I realized he had been drinking and guessed that explained the movement. I kept an eye on him because we can't legally serve people who are too drunk. Then I noticed his pants darkening near his crotch. The darkness moved down both sides and urine started to puddle on the floor, getting larger. He either pretended or didn't notice it was happening. I silently pondered the life choices I made that led me to a job where I had to watch drunks piss themselves on a Thursday night. Our manager took one for the team and cleaned it up. Thanks, Norm. There were other notable moments of entitlement, but these really stuck in my memory. A few clarifying points. Neither the boutique branch in the Walmart nor the main branch had security. I didn't call the cops because none of the incidents resulted in serious injury or damage. This took place in the late 90s in northern Alberta, Canada. I am not, nor will I ever be, AI. Anyway, thank you for watching.